My case study is the climate change film pack. In this presentation, I will first introduce the case and the section I focused on. Then I will analyze the case using the concepts of politics and hegemony, followed by two sets of assumptions and concepts. Finally, I will imagine an alternative and how this can be applied to this case study. The climate change film pack was raised by the increased concern about the significance of global climate change. This case study provides legal, curricular, and scientific guidance to support schools in transforming the film An Inconvenient Truth into a resource that appears neutral, rational, and educational. More specifically, the climate change film pack supports teachers in using the film as a teaching resource by outlining legal obligations and professional boundaries. Also, it aims to guide pupils' understanding of the climate change issue through appropriate scientific evidence. In this presentation, I choose to focus on the introduction part of this case study, which outlines legal obligations to guide teachers in delivering scientific knowledge, and provides a structural framework for the film before the class activity takes place. Why does this case study reflect political education? According to Sen, politics can be understood as the ways to manage differences between groups and shape collective decision-making. This case promotes political response to climate change, which the guidance presents the regulatory power by shaping which political interpretations are considered legitimate and how they might be taught in schools. Overall, politics is about decision-making. How it is presented in my case study, I have gave 3 questions here to represent it. These 3 questions and evidence I found in the case study mentioned and listed below demonstrate that education cannot be neutral. It always requires someone to decide what to teach. From politics to hegemony, before talking about this process, it is necessary to understand what hegemony is. Hegemony in education can be briefly understood as making the contingency product seem taken for granted. In other words, it makes decisions seem like there are no other options, which neutralizes power. In this case, the film is described as favoring one particular type of political response to climate change. Within regulatory frameworks, one political response is viewed as appropriate education, while alternative ways of understanding and responding to climate change are not entirely excluded but tightly regulated as conditional. Now let's move on to the assumption 1, consistency. Consistency in the dictionary means presenting knowledge in a coherent and non-contradictory way over time. In political education, as Sen said, teachers' authority is granted in epistemological and knowledge-based credentials, which enable them to prioritize recognized knowledge and align with legal and curricular frameworks. In this case, consistency is evident in these 2 legal obligation codes. These 2 codes identify how teachers and other authorities are regulated when delivering the knowledge. Words such as shall forbid, must be careful, and not to promote represent the standardized expectations of teaching for teachers to maintain consistency. However, is consistency an applicable assumption? The quotes from Arendt argue that an absolute truth is always shaped by plurality, because individuals live in relation to multiple interpretations, experiences, and relationships. The concept of plurality suggests that consistency in education may function as a regulatory ideal rather than an achievable condition. Arendt's concept of plurality reminds us that while consistency is prioritized as governing principle, alternative interpretations and political responses are marginalized because teachers and students inevitably have different understanding and experiences of it. That suggests that consistency does not simply organize teaching, but also limits the range of political meanings that can be explored within the classroom. Now let's come to the second assumption, anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism refers to the assumption that humans are at the center of knowledge, value, and political concern. It positions humans as the center of the world. In education, this assumption shapes how issues such as climate change are framed, prioritizing human needs, impact, and responsibilities over those of non-human species. The languages used in the climate change film pack, such as challenges in the world and questions like what does this mean to me, implicitly prioritize human perspectives and experiences. Climate change is thus framed primarily in terms of its significance for human understanding, action, and responsibility. Is anthropocentrism always an applicable assumption? According to Faber-McAllister's code, nature culture refers to an indivisible connection in which humans and non-humans are mutually inseparable and co-constitute one another. The nature culture concept challenges the idea that humans stand apart from or above the natural world. Based on this concept, the case study primarily viewed climate change as a challenge for human society, positioning humans as primary subject of concern and action. However, this framing marginalizes ecosystems, animals, and other non-human species, making them largely invisible within the education framing rather than treating them as active participants in climate relations. Based on the assumptions and concepts analyzed previously, this alternative framework is imagined through legal obligations, transforming knowledge from a focus on consistency and anthropocentrism into a guide to help students understand different interpretive judgments alongside considerations of how human and non-human species interact. To apply this framework in this case, it needs to acknowledge that teachers may have different partisan political views and invite students to examine why these differences occur. Here, consistency is no longer understood as sameness of meaning, but as a shared commitment to critical reasoning, enacted through making different interpretations visible, also tracing how human and non-human species mutually affect one another, rather than seeing it as an individual response. Compared to the assumptions, this alternative introduces greater openness by recognizing diverse interpretive judgments, but also increases the responsibilities placed on teachers to navigate legal constraints around partisan promotion. These alternatives expand civic and ecological understanding, but increase pedagogical and regulatory complexity. However, taken together, these alternatives provide students with a more comprehensive way to learn about climate change. These are the references. Overall, this case study illustrates how political education seeks to govern climate change through assumptions of consistency and anthropocentrism. Through the concepts of polarity and nature culture, these assumptions have been questioned, opening space to imagine an alternative constraint by legal and institutional frameworks.